Dr. Danielle Carter stepped into the bustling terminal, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She maneuvered through the sea of hurried travelers with an air of calm, her suitcase rolling smoothly behind her. The chaos around her seemed distant, almost muted, as her mind lingered on the thought of sinking into her first-class seat. After a grueling week at the conference, the quiet luxury of the flight felt like a small but much-needed reward. The first-class check-in counter sat away from the main hustle, its sleek design and shorter lines offering a glimpse of the calm Danielle craved. She approached the counter, handing over her ID and ticket confirmation with a polite smile. The agent, a young man with a friendly demeanor, quickly processed her check-in. "Dr. Carter, everything looks great. Here's your boarding pass," he said, handing it back to her along with a courteous nod. "Your gate is just down that way. Enjoy your flight." Danielle thanked him and made her way toward the security checkpoint. She was accustomed to navigating airports, the long lines, the impatient travelers, and the constant reminders to remove laptops and liquids had long since become routine. Yet this time, the process felt especially tedious. Her mind was heavy, her body drained, and all she could think about was getting to her seat, closing her eyes, and shutting out the world for a while. After passing through security, Danielle stopped briefly at a cafe near her gate. She ordered a green tea, the warm aroma soothing her nerves as she took a sip. Glancing at the time, she saw she still had 20 minutes before boarding began. She found a quiet corner and settled into a chair, pulling out her phone to check her messages. A text from her sister popped up. "Hey sis, how did the conference go? Saw your keynote clip online? So proud of you. Can't wait to hear all about it." Danielle smiled softly, her heart swelling with warmth. Her sister Mia was her biggest cheerleader, always the first to celebrate her wins. She quickly typed out a reply. "It went well, exhausting but worth it. I'll call you when I land. Love you." Setting her phone aside, Danielle leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the tea seep through her hands. Her mind wandered back to the keynote speech. Standing on that stage addressing a room full of seasoned professionals had been exhilarating yet nerve-wracking. She had poured her heart into the presentation, sharing insights that could transform emergency response protocols, and the standing ovation she received still felt surreal. But behind that applause, she couldn't forget the subtle tension she had felt, the weight of being the only black woman on stage, the murmurs in the crowd, the fleeting looks that questioned her presence. It was always there, a constant undercurrent she had learned to navigate but could never fully ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted by the announcement of her flight's boarding. She gathered her belongings and made her way to the gate, joining the priority boarding line for first-class passengers. The line was short, filled mostly with business travelers, their briefcases and designer luggage, a stark contrast to the chaotic lines of economy class just a few feet away. Danielle stepped onto the plane, the cool, pressurized air greeting her as she entered. A flight attendant smiled warmly, gesturing her toward her seat. The first-class cabin was a haven of comfort. Wide, plush seats, extra legroom, and the promise of peace. She found her seat by the window, stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, and sank into the cushioned chair. As the plane filled, she pulled out a book, hoping to lose herself in its pages for the next few hours. The quiet hum of passengers settling in was almost soothing, but her moment of calm was short-lived. A sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Excuse me," a middle-aged woman in a tailored blazer said loudly, her tone dripping with indignation. "I think there's been a mistake. That seat belongs to someone else." Danielle looked up from her book, her brow furrowing in confusion. The woman was pointing directly at her. "That's my seat," the woman continued, addressing the flight attendant now. "There's no way this is correct." The flight attendant blinked, her professional smile faltering slightly. "Ma'am, I believe there's no mistake. Dr. Carter is seated here." The woman's eyes flicked to Danielle, narrowing slightly. "Dr. Carter?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Well, this must be some sort of mix-up. There's no reason someone like her should be in first class." Danielle's stomach tightened, a familiar wave of frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She straightened in her seat, meeting the woman's gaze with steady composure. "There's no mistake," she said, her voice firm but measured. "This is my seat." The woman scoffed, her cheeks flushing. "Well, I'd like to speak to someone about this," she snapped, turning back to the flight attendant. "This is absolutely unacceptable." The flight attendant glanced nervously between them, her professional demeanor cracking under the tension. "Ma'am, if you'd like, I can check your ticket and seat assignment," she offered, trying to diffuse the situation. The woman huffed but handed over her ticket, her lips pressed into a thin line. Danielle remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap, her face impassive. But inside, her thoughts churned. It was always the same, the looks, the comments, the unspoken doubts. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, it was never enough to erase the assumptions. The flight attendant's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ma'am," she said to the woman, "your seat is in economy. There's been no mistake." The woman's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. "Well," she finally sputtered, "I still think this is inappropriate. She doesn't belong here." Danielle's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the window. She had learned long ago that dignity was the best armor in moments like these. The flight attendant's smile hardened. "Ma'am, if you'd like to take your assigned seat, we can prepare for takeoff." The woman muttered something under her breath before stalking off toward the economy cabin, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. The tension in the cabin eased slightly, but Danielle's chest felt tight. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as the flight attendant leaned down to her. "I'm so sorry about that, Dr. Carter," she said softly. "Please let me know if there's anything I can do for you." Danielle nodded, offering a faint smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, but inside she couldn't shake the heaviness that lingered. This flight was supposed to be a chance to rest, to recharge, but the weight of prejudice had found her even here. She closed her eyes, leaning back against the seat, willing herself to focus on the journey ahead. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. But even as they lifted into the air, Danielle couldn't help but feel the burden of everything she carried with her. Danielle approached the airline counter, her conference badge still dangling around her neck. A young attendant greeted her with a warm smile, her eyes briefly flicking to the badge. "Good evening, Dr. Carter. Headed back home?" Danielle returned the smile, her voice calm but tinged with fatigue. "Yes, back to Atlanta." The attendant scanned her ticket and passport with practiced efficiency, handing them back as she tilted her head slightly. "Long trip?" Danielle nodded, the exhaustion evident in her posture. "It's been a busy week." The woman's expression softened with a touch of sympathy. "Well, I hope you enjoy your flight. First class should be a nice way to relax." "Thank you," Danielle replied, taking her boarding pass and heading toward the priority security line. As she stood in line, she took a deep breath, letting the sounds and sights of the airport surround her. There was something oddly soothing about airports. The constant movement, the transient nature of it all. It felt like being in a liminal space, disconnected from the demands of life, if only temporarily. Here, she wasn't a doctor or a keynote speaker, she was just another traveler. For a brief moment, she could blend into the rhythm of the crowd. The security process was seamless, and soon Danielle found herself strolling through the terminal. The bright lights illuminated rows of shops and restaurants, their displays a mix of souvenirs, snacks, and travel essentials. She wasn't particularly hungry, but walking through the concourse felt like a comforting ritual, a way to unwind after the high-energy environment of the conference. Passing a newsstand, Danielle caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. She paused, taking in her appearance. Her deep brown skin glowed softly under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her short, tightly coiled hair framed her face with an effortless elegance. Her pressed slacks and sleek blouse radiated professionalism, a testament to the career she had worked tirelessly to build. Yet, despite her polished exterior, her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. The exhaustion, the constant pressure, the battles fought both silently and openly. She fixed her gaze on his with the fleet intensity. Her thoughts wandered as she resumed walking. She reflected on her journey, how much she had sacrificed and endured to get where she was. Being a Black woman in medicine came with unique challenges, and the road had never been smooth. There were triumphs, yes, but also countless moments of frustration, doubt, and the persistent need to prove herself. No matter how far she had come, there was always that lingering awareness, that ever-present reminder of the biases she faced. Reaching her gate, Danielle scanned the waiting area for a seat. A few passengers sat scattered throughout the room, scrolling through phones or flipping through magazines. She spotted an open seat by the window and made her way over. Settling into the chair, she pulled out her phone and glanced at her emails. Predictably, her inbox was flooded with messages from the hospital. Questions about upcoming shifts, updates on patients, and requests for her input on cases. She responded to the most urgent ones, her fingers flying across the screen with the precision of someone who was used to multitasking under pressure. But her heart wasn't in it. For once, she needed to step away from the constant pull of her responsibilities. This flight, she reminded herself, was supposed to be a moment of reprieve, a chance to rest before diving back into the whirlwind of the ER. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, and Danielle rose with the first-class passengers. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it with a friendly smile. Stepping onto the jet bridge, Danielle welcomed the shift in atmosphere. The bustling terminal noise faded behind her, replaced by the quieter hum of the plane's interior. The first-class cabin was an oasis. The wide leather seats, the soft lighting, and the calm ambience immediately put her at ease. A flight attendant greeted her warmly, offering to stow her carry-on in the overhead bin. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Carter," the attendant said with a practiced but genuine smile. "Please let us know if there's anything you need during the flight." Danielle gave a tired but appreciative nod. "Thank you. I think I just need some quiet," she replied, her voice laced with exhaustion. She settled into her seat, adjusting its recline and placing her noise-canceling headphones around her neck. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. Her body sank into the plush leather, and she closed her eyes for a moment, the soft hum of the engines already beginning to soothe her. As the other passengers boarded, Danielle opened her eyes briefly, watching as people made their way to their seats. Some carried briefcases, others juggled children and travel bags. The mundane choreography of boarding a plane felt oddly grounding. She leaned back, pulling out a book from her bag, hoping to lose herself in its pages for the duration of the flight. But just as the cabin began to settle, a voice broke through her brief moment of calm. "Excuse me?" A woman's sharp tone cut through the air. Danielle's eyes flicked up from her book, and she saw a middle-aged woman standing a few rows away, her gaze fixed on her. "I believe you're in the wrong seat," the woman said, her voice tinged with an unmistakable edge of disdain. Danielle blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, are you speaking to me?" she asked, her tone calm but wary. The woman's lips thinned into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I am. This is first class," she said, her words pointed. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Danielle's stomach tightened, but she kept her composure. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said evenly, her voice firm but measured. The flight attendant stepped in quickly, her voice soothing but authoritative. "Ma'am, Dr. Carter is in the correct seat. Please let me help you find yours." The woman's cheeks flushed as she muttered something under her breath and moved down the aisle, still throwing occasional glances in Danielle's direction. Danielle exhaled quietly, her grip on her book tightening. It wasn't the first time she'd faced something like this, and she doubted it would be the last, but that didn't make it any easier. The flight attendant leaned down, her voice low. "I'm so sorry for that, Dr. Carter. Please let us know if you need anything." Danielle nodded, managing a faint smile. "Thank you," she said softly, returning her gaze to the window. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the tarmac. She closed her book, leaning her head against the headrest as the plane prepared for takeoff. Her moment of peace had been interrupted, but she wouldn't let it be stolen entirely. This was her space, her seat, and her journey. No one could take that away from her. The hum of the plane, the muted chatter of a few seated passengers, and the faint rustle of flight attendants preparing for takeoff, all of it should have created a peaceful cocoon for Danielle. She was on the verge of closing her eyes, letting the day fade into the background, when her attention was drawn to a small commotion at the front of the cabin. A young boy, no older than 7 or 8, was wrestling with his seatbelt, his small hands fumbling with the clasp. His frustration was evident as he squirmed in his seat, his cheeks puffing out in irritation. Beside him, his mother, a tall, meticulously dressed white woman, was busy arranging their carry-ons in the overhead bin. Her movements were precise but hurried, and her face carried the telltale signs of travel stress, tight lips and furrowed brows. Danielle's instinct to help kicked in before she could stop herself. She leaned forward with a gentle smile. "Here, let me give you a hand," she said softly, reaching over to fasten the boy's seatbelt with practiced ease. The boy looked up at her, his frustration dissolving into an innocent, wide-eyed smile. "Thanks," he chirped, his gratitude bubbling over with enthusiasm. Danielle couldn't help but smile back, his energy infectious. As she settled back into her seat, however, her gaze unintentionally met the cold, assessing stare of the boy's mother. The woman's expression was unreadable, but her tightly pressed lips and subtly narrowed eyes conveyed something Danielle recognized all too well. It was the look. The one that carried unspoken judgment, quiet disapproval, wrapped in a veil of civility. Danielle forced herself to shrug it off, rationalizing that the woman was probably just frazzled from traveling with a child, but the feeling lingered, prickling at the edge of her thoughts like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. She had encountered that look countless times before, and while it never failed to sting, she had learned to steel herself against it. Still, it cast a shadow over the sense of calm she had hoped to find on this flight. More passengers trickled into the first-class cabin, but Danielle barely registered their arrival. She tried to shake off the unease, leaning her head back against the plush headrest and closing her eyes. Her plan was simple: tune out, escape into the hum of the engines, and let the world fall away for a while. But no matter how much she tried, the woman's sharp, silent judgment refused to leave her mind. It clung to her like a stubborn fog, clouding the peace she so desperately craved. Danielle had always valued the solitude of flying. It was one of the rare moments she could shed the weight of her professional persona, the ever-poised, endlessly competent Dr. Danielle Carter, and simply exist as herself. Tonight, however, even that reprieve seemed just out of reach. She opened her eyes and pulled out her phone, her thumb instinctively opening her email app. Messages from the hospital in Atlanta filled her inbox. Updates, questions, requests. She skimmed through them without much focus, her mind elsewhere. A quiet sigh escaped her lips as she tucked the phone away again. The conference, the pressure to excel, and now this subtle but cutting moment of tension. All of it swirled in her thoughts, refusing to settle. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Danielle turned her head to watch the runway lights blur past the window. She tried to lose herself in the soothing monotony of the pre-flight routine. Her eyes drifted shut, and for the first time that day, she felt herself begin to let go. But the peace was short-lived. A sharp voice pierced the quiet, low but laced with irritation. "I'm not sitting next to her." Danielle's eyes snapped open. For a moment she thought she might have misheard. But the voice came again, hushed but insistent, carrying the unmistakable edge of restrained anger. "I'm sorry, ma'am," came the gentle response of a flight attendant. "Is there an issue with your seat?" "Yes, there's an issue," the woman hissed, her voice rising slightly. "I don't want to sit next to her." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to turn around to know who the woman was referring to. The venom in the woman's tone was all too familiar. It wasn't about seating preferences or legroom, it was about her. The weight of the words settled heavily on Danielle's chest, a nauseating wave of indignation and disbelief rolling through her. Her grip tightened on the armrest as her jaw clenched. She wanted to turn around, to confront the woman and demand an explanation, but the sharp sting of the moment left her rooted in place, her heart pounding in her ears. The flight attendant's voice softened, a clear attempt to de-escalate. "Ma'am, all seats in this cabin are assigned. If there's a specific issue, I'd be happy to assist you, but I need to ask you to remain seated." The woman's response was barely audible, but Danielle didn't need to hear it. She could feel the disdain radiating from behind her, an unspoken accusation that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Danielle exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the seatback in front of her. She had dealt with moments like this before, moments where her presence alone seemed to offend someone's preconceived notions of who belonged where, but knowing how to handle it didn't make it any less infuriating. As the plane began to taxi, Danielle leaned her head against the window, her reflection staring back at her. She forced herself to breathe, to let the rhythm of the engine's hum calm her. She had done nothing wrong. She didn't owe anyone an explanation or an apology for being here. This was her seat, her flight, her moment of peace. Still, the woman's words echoed in her mind, a bitter reminder of the prejudice that lingered in places where it had no place being. The woman's sharp words hung in the air like a knife, cutting into the fragile peace Danielle had hoped to find. She sat frozen for a moment, her pulse quickening as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had been here before, too many times to count. Subtle slights, veiled insults, or outright hostility cloaked in entitlement. Each instance felt like a wound that had healed just enough to leave a scar, only for it to be reopened. Danielle's mind raced, her chest tightening with the familiar frustration of being forced into a moment where she had to decide how to respond to something she shouldn't even have to face. Her hands gripped the armrests, steadying herself, as the flight attendant's voice broke through the tension. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice tight and measured, though there was a clear nervousness in her tone, "but all seats are assigned and we're fully booked in first class. There's no other place to move you." The woman's face twisted with indignation. "Then move her," she demanded, her tone sharp and uncompromising, gesturing toward Danielle as though she were an object rather than a person. "I paid for first class, and I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who—" She stopped short, but her meaning was clear. Danielle's stomach twisted, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and hurt. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now, their gazes weighing heavily as though they were watching a show unfold rather than witnessing a human being being dehumanized. Yet no one spoke up. They never did. That was always the worst part, the silence, the complicity. It was a reminder that when it came down to it, standing up for someone else was just too uncomfortable for most people. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering between the woman and Danielle. "Dr. Carter," she began hesitantly, her voice soft as though she were asking for an enormous favor. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, but would it be possible for you?" Danielle knew what was coming before the words left the woman's mouth. The same request, dressed up in politeness but laced with the same inequity. Could you be the one to accommodate? Could you sacrifice your peace, your dignity, to make someone else feel at ease in their prejudice? For a brief moment, Danielle considered refusing. She wanted to stay right where she was, to assert her right to occupy this space that she had earned, both financially and through a lifetime of hard work and resilience. Every part of her wanted to say, "No, I won't move." She had spent years proving herself, rising to the top of her field, and she had paid for this seat like everyone else. She deserved to be here. But exhaustion weighed her down. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that came not just from the week of non-stop conferences and long hours, but from the years of constantly having to fight these battles. She was tired of always being the one to take the high road, the one to rise above, the one expected to shoulder the burden of someone else's ignorance. With a steadying breath, Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. She moved with a deliberate calmness that belied the storm brewing inside her. She refused to look at the woman who had demanded her removal, though she could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from her. Instead, she turned to the flight attendant, who looked visibly relieved. "Thank you so much, Dr. Carter," the flight attendant whispered, her tone filled with genuine regret. "I'll find you a seat in economy." Danielle nodded, saying nothing, and began to collect her things. The silence from the other passengers felt suffocating, as though their indifference was a physical presence pressing down on her. Not one person spoke up. Not one person challenged the woman or offered Danielle a word of solidarity. They simply watched, their silence a deafening affirmation of what had just happened. The walk to the economy section felt endless. Each step was heavy with humiliation, her head held high despite the ache in her chest. When she finally reached her new seat, the contrast was stark. The cramped, narrow space barely accommodated her, the armrests digging into her sides and the lack of legroom a harsh reminder of the comfort she had been forced to leave behind. Danielle sank into the seat, her body tense, and stared out the window. The city lights below blurred into a sea of gold as the plane began to ascend. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, strong, composed, but undeniably hurt. She tried to focus on her breathing, to push down the rising tide of anger and frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. All she had wanted was a moment of peace, a few hours to disconnect from the world and prepare herself for the chaos of the emergency room waiting for her back in Atlanta. But instead, she had been reminded yet again that no matter how much she achieved, no matter how far she climbed, there would always be those who saw her as less. Danielle closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She told herself it didn't matter, that she would get through this like she always did. But the truth was, it did matter. It mattered deeply, and it wasn't fair. It had never been fair. Danielle's grip on the armrest tightened, her nails digging into the fabric as the businessman's careless words echoed in her ears. She stared out of the window, her reflection faint against the dark sky outside. A part of her wanted to whip around, to confront him, to say something that would make him realize just how wrong he was. But she didn't. She couldn't. Years of enduring similar moments had taught her to swallow the anger, to keep her composure, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The hum of the plane's engines was no longer soothing, it seemed to amplify the sting of the moment. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, trying to rein in the storm inside her. "Let it go," she told herself. "You're bigger than this." But the bitterness lingered like a bitter aftertaste she couldn't wash away. Her mind drifted back to the countless times she had faced moments like this, small and large, in every corner of her life. The professors in medical school who had questioned her aptitude, the colleagues who had underestimated her, the patients who had demanded a real doctor without realizing they were already speaking to one. Every instance had been a reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she accomplished, there would always be someone ready to reduce her worth to a stereotype. Danielle shifted in her seat, the cramped space making her feel even smaller. Her knees bumped against the tray table in front of her, and the armrest dug into her side. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that gnawed at her, it was the emotional weight of being made to feel out of place yet again. The indignity of it all sat heavy in her chest, pressing down with every breath. She thought back to the flight attendant's apologetic tone, to the other passengers who had watched the entire scene unfold without saying a word. Their silence had been deafening. It always was. It was the silence of complicity, the silence that screamed louder than any insult. For a moment Danielle felt a pang of regret for not speaking up, for not making a stand and forcing everyone to confront the injustice they had witnessed. But she also knew the cost of such moments. Speaking up meant becoming the angry black woman, a label that followed her like a shadow, no matter how justified her anger might be. Across the aisle, the businessmen were still talking, their voices carrying above the steady hum of the plane. Their laughter grated on her nerves, each chuckle like a jab reminding her of the humiliation she had endured. Danielle straightened in her seat, her shoulders pulling back as she tried to focus on the faint glimmers of stars outside the window. She had survived worse than this, she reminded herself. She had built a life, a career, a legacy that no amount of ignorance could take away from her. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. Danielle's phone vibrated softly in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before reaching for it, glancing down at the notification. It was another email from the hospital, likely another request for her expertise. She sighed, placing the phone back in her pocket without reading it. The weight of her responsibilities at the hospital felt almost comforting compared to the weight of the moment she was trapped in now. At least in the ER she knew her worth. At least there she was seen for who she was. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes. The tightness in her chest hadn't eased, but she knew she couldn't let it consume her. She had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to push them down until she could deal with them in her own time. Tonight would be no different. She reminded herself that this was just one flight, one moment in a life filled with victories that far outweighed the ignorance she encountered. But even as she repeated those words in her mind, the bitterness lingered. It was a wound that never fully healed, a reminder that no matter how much she achieved, there would always be people ready to cut her down. And yet, Danielle Carter was still here, still standing, still fighting, because that's who she was, a fighter, always. Cody's seat, where the sound had come from, the boy was hunched over, clutching his chest, his small face pale and twisted in pain. His mother, the same woman who had insisted Danielle be moved, was panicking. Her hands fluttered uselessly over her son, her voice rising in frantic, high-pitched questions. "Cody? Cody, what's wrong? Speak to me," she cried, her voice breaking. Passengers around them turned in their seats, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. Murmurs filled the cabin, but no one moved. Danielle was already on her feet, weaving her way quickly through the narrow aisle toward Cody. Every instinct honed from years in the ER kicked in, overriding her earlier frustration and humiliation. "Step back," Danielle said firmly as she reached their row, her voice cutting through the chaos. Cody's mother turned to her, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. For a moment, recognition flickered across her face, the realization of who Danielle was, and then her fear took over. "Do something, he can't breathe," the woman gasped, her earlier disdain replaced by raw panic. Danielle crouched down to Cody's level, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. His breaths were shallow and rapid, and his chest heaved with effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes darted around wildly. "Cody, I'm here to help," Danielle said, her voice calm and soothing. "I need you to try to slow your breathing, okay? Can you do that for me, buddy?" The boy gave a weak nod but couldn't manage to slow his breaths. Danielle's practiced eye assessed him quickly. Labored breathing, cyanosis creeping into his lips, and his hands clenched into fists, a classic sign of a severe asthma attack or an allergic reaction. "Does he have a history of asthma or allergies?" Danielle asked, her tone direct and steady as she glanced up at the mother. Yes, he has asthma, the woman stammered, her hands trembling. He has an inhaler, but I don't know where it is. It's in one of the bags. Danielle didn't wait for her to finish. She turned to a nearby flight attendant who was frozen in place, unsure of how to help. Find the medical kit and oxygen mask now, Danielle ordered, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. And tell the captain to alert the nearest airport. We may need to make an emergency landing. The flight attendant snapped into action, rushing toward the front of the plane. Danielle turned her attention back to Cody, keeping her voice steady and reassuring. Cody, listen to me. You're going to be okay. I just need you to keep looking at me and focus on taking slower breaths, even if it's hard. In and out, like this, she said, demonstrating deep, deliberate breaths. His little hands reached for hers, gripping tightly as he tried to mimic her breathing. His wheezing was loud and strained, but Danielle could see the determination in his eyes. The flight attendant returned with the oxygen mask and the medical kit. Danielle worked quickly, attaching the mask to Cody's face and adjusting the flow of oxygen. She reached into the kit, searching for anything that might help stabilize him until they landed. Her fingers found a vial of albuterol and a nebulizer attachment. Perfect, she murmured, her movements swift and precise as she prepared the medication. Passengers watched in tense silence, some leaning into the aisle to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Danielle didn't care about the stares. Her sole focus was on the little boy in front of her. Cody, you're doing great, she said softly as she connected the nebulizer to the oxygen mask. This medicine is going to help your lungs open up so you can breathe easier. Just keep the mask on, okay? You're so brave. As the medication flowed into Cody's lungs, his breathing began to slow, the wheezing gradually easing. His chest rose and fell more evenly, and the color started to return to his cheeks. Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She placed a gentle hand on Cody's forehead, brushing back his damp hair. You're going to be just fine, she whispered. The boy's mother looked at Danielle with tears streaming down her face, her earlier hostility replaced by overwhelming gratitude. Thank you, she choked out. Thank you for saving my son. Danielle met her gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. And just doing my job, she said quietly, turning her attention back to Cody, who was now drifting into an exhausted but peaceful sleep. The tension in the cabin began to ease, passengers murmuring in relief as they realized the crisis had passed. But Danielle's heart remained heavy. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. The same woman who had dismissed her so easily was now looking at her as though she were a hero. Danielle took a deep breath, her focus shifting back to Cody. For now, he was all that mattered. Cody's small chest continued to rise and fall unevenly under the oxygen mask, but the faint blue tint to his lips began to fade. His terrified eyes, still glistening with tears, softened slightly as the oxygen did its work. Danielle kept her focus locked on him, her hand never leaving his shoulder, anchoring him as his breaths slowly deepened. Melissa clung to Cody's other hand, her own trembling uncontrollably. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you for helping him." Danielle didn't respond immediately, her mind was still racing, scanning through every possibility, every potential complication. The oxygen had helped for now, but they weren't out of the woods yet. Without an inhaler or proper medication, Cody was still at risk. She glanced at the flight attendant, who was standing nearby with a worried expression. "I need to know exactly what medical supplies you have on board," Danielle said, her tone firm but calm. "Do you have a nebulizer or any medications like albuterol?" The flight attendant nodded, fumbling with a small first aid kit. "We have a nebulizer and a few emergency medications. I'll check right now." She hurried off again, leaving Danielle to continue monitoring Cody. Melissa's grip on Cody's hand tightened as she turned to Danielle, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. I didn't think this would happen. He's never had an attack this bad before. I should have..." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. "I should have made sure he had his inhaler." Danielle glanced at her, her voice softening just slightly. "What matters now is that we're helping him. Focus on staying calm for Cody. He needs you to be steady." Melissa nodded shakily, taking a deep breath and wiping her eyes. Danielle could see the regret etched into every line of her face. But there was no time for blame or shame. Cody needed all of their attention now. The flight attendant returned with the nebulizer and a small vial of albuterol. Danielle's chest loosened slightly as relief washed over her. "This will help," she said, taking the equipment and quickly assembling it. Her hands worked deftly, her years of training allowing her to operate even in the cramped and chaotic space of the airplane cabin. "Cody," Danielle said gently as she brought the nebulizer closer to his face, "this is going to feel a little funny, but it'll help you breathe. Just keep taking slow breaths, okay? You're doing great." Cody gave a small nod, his wide eyes still locked on Danielle's face. She placed the nebulizer over his mouth and nose, holding it steady as the mist began to flow. The sound of the device filled the cabin, a soft hum that felt like a lifeline. Cody's little body started to relax, his shoulders no longer heaving with each breath. Melissa let out a shaky sob of relief, her free hand covering her mouth as she watched her son begin to stabilize. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Danielle didn't look up, her focus remaining on Cody. "Keep holding his hand," she said. "Talk to him. Let him know you're here." Melissa nodded, leaning closer to Cody. "Mommy's here, baby," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You're so brave. Just keep breathing, okay? I'm right here." Minutes passed, and the tension in the cabin began to ease. Cody's breathing became more regular, the color returning to his cheeks. The other passengers, who had been watching in silence, murmured softly among themselves, their earlier judgment replaced by admiration. Danielle could feel their eyes on her, but she ignored them. Cody was the only thing that mattered. Finally, Danielle removed the nebulizer and checked Cody's vitals again. "His breathing's much better now," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. She turned to Melissa, meeting her tearful gaze. "He's stable, but we need to monitor him closely for the rest of the flight. If anything changes, I'll be right here." Melissa nodded fervently, her hands still clutching Cody's. "You saved him," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "I don't even know how to thank you." Danielle stood, stretching her stiff legs. She looked down at Melissa, her expression calm but unreadable. "You don't need to thank me, just take care of him." As Danielle stepped back to give the family space, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She hadn't done it for Melissa or for the stares of the passengers. She'd done it because Cody needed her, because she couldn't stand by and let a child suffer, even if his mother had made her feel unwelcome only hours before. The plane cabin grew quieter as passengers returned to their own seats, their gazes lingering on Danielle with newfound respect. She returned to her economy seat, her body heavy with fatigue but her mind racing. Despite everything, she felt no triumph, only the familiar mix of relief and exhaustion that came after saving a life. As she sat back, closing her eyes briefly, the only sound that mattered was the soft, steady breathing of a little boy whose life she had fought to protect. Danielle's words hung in the air, firm yet soothing, her tone an anchor in the turbulence of the moment. Melissa nodded, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." Danielle paused, her gaze shifting from Melissa to Cody, whose chest rose and fell in a rhythm that, while fragile, was steady. "Just focus on him," Danielle replied softly. "That's what matters right now." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't just tears of fear. They carried something heavier, something closer to shame. "I was wrong," she murmured, her voice cracking. "About you? About everything." Danielle met Melissa's gaze, her expression unreadable. For a moment the weight of Melissa's words lingered between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Danielle didn't respond, not yet. There were too many emotions swirling inside her, exhaustion, frustration, and a profound sense of purpose. She focused instead on Cody, adjusting the oxygen mask and monitoring his breathing. The cabin was still, the other passengers now silent, their earlier indifference replaced with quiet observation. Danielle could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't acknowledge them. This wasn't about validation or proving anything to anyone. It was about doing her job, about saving a life, regardless of the circumstances. The flight attendant returned, her face a mixture of concern and respect. "The captain says we're about an hour from Atlanta," she said quietly. "If you think we need to land sooner." Danielle shook her head. "If his breathing remains stable, we can make it. But I need you to be ready. If anything changes, we'll have to act fast." The flight attendant nodded, her respect for Danielle evident in the way she followed every instruction without hesitation. "Understood, Dr. Carter. We're here if you need anything." Danielle turned back to Melissa, who was holding Cody's hand as if her grip alone could keep him safe. "We need to keep him calm," Danielle said gently. "Talk to him, keep his mind off what's happening." Melissa sniffled and nodded, leaning close to Cody. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice shaky but tender. "You're doing so great. Mommy's right here and Dr. Carter's taking such good care of you. We're almost there, okay?" Cody blinked up at his mother, his small hand tightening around hers. His voice was faint but steady as he murmured, "Okay, Mommy." Danielle felt a knot in her chest loosen at the sound of his voice. It was faint, but it was there, a sign that he was still fighting. She watched as Melissa's demeanor shifted, her earlier hostility completely replaced by vulnerability and gratitude. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was real, and Danielle could see it in the way Melissa's eyes lingered on her, filled with unspoken regret. As the plane cruised through the night sky, the atmosphere in the cabin began to ease. Passengers who had initially avoided Danielle's gaze now looked at her with quiet admiration. The tension that had filled the first-class cabin hours earlier had dissipated, replaced by a collective sense of awe at the woman who had stepped in without hesitation to save a child. Danielle returned to her seat in economy, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind alert. She kept her eyes on Cody, watching for any signs of distress. Melissa met her gaze occasionally, offering a small, hesitant smile, a silent acknowledgement of the role Danielle had played in saving her son. The minutes felt like hours, but as the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Danielle allowed herself a small breath of relief. Cody's breathing remained steady, his oxygen levels stable. The crisis wasn't over, there would still be challenges ahead, but for now, he was safe. When the plane touched down, a cheer erupted from the passengers. Danielle felt a pang of discomfort at the applause. She hadn't done this for recognition. Her focus had been on Cody and ensuring he got through the flight safely. As the doors opened and the passengers began to disembark, Melissa turned to Danielle, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for everything. I'll never forget what you did for us." Danielle nodded, her expression softening for the first time. "Take care of him," she said simply. Melissa hesitated, then added, "And I'm sorry, for everything before." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She studied Melissa for a moment, then said, "Apology accepted. Just remember, what matters most is how we choose to move forward." Melissa nodded, her gratitude evident as she gathered Cody in her arms and stepped off the plane. Danielle remained in her seat for a moment longer, allowing the cabin to empty before standing. She stretched her stiff limbs, her mind already shifting to the hospital shift awaiting her. She knew the world wouldn't change overnight, but in this small moment, she had made an impact. And that was enough. As she stepped off the plane, the cool night air greeted her, refreshing and grounding. She took a deep breath, her thoughts focused on what lay ahead, and walked toward the next chapter of her journey. Danielle's steady voice was a lifeline in the swirling chaos of the moment. Cody's small frame trembled under her touch, his shallow breaths like a fragile thread holding him to consciousness. Melissa gripped his hand tightly, whispering soothing words through her tears, though her fear was unmistakable. The plane continued its rapid descent, the low hum of the engines rising in pitch as the ground drew closer. Danielle glanced at the heart monitor attached to Cody, her pulse sinking with the rapid beating. His oxygen levels were critical, but the mask was helping, barely. Every second felt like an eternity, and Danielle knew how quickly an asthma attack could spiral. Time wasn't on their side, but at least the emergency landing was imminent. Melissa looked up at Danielle, her voice quivering. "Is he going to be okay? Please tell me he'll be okay?" Danielle's expression was calm, though her mind raced through contingency plans. "We're doing everything we can," she said, her tone firm but compassionate. "Right now, the oxygen is helping, but we need to get him to the ground where we can do more for him. The descent will make it easier for him to breathe." Melissa nodded, her eyes glistening with tears as she turned her attention back to Cody. "You're so brave, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking his hair. "Just hold on a little longer." The cabin was eerily quiet, every passenger's gaze fixed on the scene unfolding at the front of the plane. Danielle could feel the weight of their stares, but she ignored them, pouring every ounce of focus into the boy struggling for air in front of her. She had faced countless emergencies in her career, but something about this moment felt heavier. Maybe it was the confined space of the plane, the suffocating tension in the air. Or maybe it was Melissa's earlier disdain now transformed into desperate gratitude. Danielle gently adjusted the oxygen mask, her eyes never leaving Cody's. "You're doing amazing, Cody," she said softly, her voice like a balm against his fear. "Just keep breathing with me." In and out, nice and slow. You're so strong. Cody's wide eyes blinked up at her, his trust palpable even through his exhaustion. His breaths were still shallow and wheezy, but they were steady, and that was enough to keep Danielle going. She glanced at the flight attendant standing nearby, who was gripping the back of a seat, her knuckles white. "How much longer until we land?" Danielle asked, her voice clipped but calm. "About 10 minutes, the flight attendant replied, her voice tight with tension. "The emergency crew is already on standby in Denver." Danielle nodded, her jaw tightening as she focused on Cody again. "Good. Let them know he'll need immediate respiratory support and likely medication as soon as we land." The flight attendant darted off to relay the message, leaving Danielle and Melissa with Cody as the plane continued its descent. Melissa's earlier panic had morphed into quiet desperation, her tears falling freely as she watched her son fight for every breath. "I should have brought the inhaler," she murmured, her voice thick with guilt. "I should have been more careful." Danielle placed a steadying hand on Melissa's shoulder, her gaze firm but kind. "This isn't the time for blame," she said. "You're here for him now, and that's what matters. He needs you to stay strong." Melissa nodded, sniffling as she wiped her tears. "I'm trying," she whispered. Michelle took her hand. The plane jolted slightly as it descended through a pocket of turbulence, and Danielle instinctively braced herself, her hand steady on Cody's shoulder. The pressure in the cabin was easing as they approached a lower altitude, and she could see the faintest improvement in Cody's breathing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. "See that, Cody?" Danielle said, her voice warm and encouraging. "You're doing it. You're getting through this. We're almost there." Cody's tiny hand reached for his mother's, squeezing weakly as he managed a faint nod. Melissa let out a choked sob, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "You're so strong, baby," she whispered. "You're my brave little boy." Danielle allowed herself a small exhale, the tension in her chest loosening ever so slightly. The moments that followed were a blur of quiet encouragement and steady monitoring as the plane prepared for landing. Danielle could feel the eyes of the passengers behind her, their earlier silence now filled with admiration and respect. But she wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about Cody, about keeping him safe, about getting him to the ground where real help awaited. Finally, the wheels of the plane touched down with a jarring thud, the cabin erupting into a round of relieved applause. Danielle didn't flinch or celebrate. Her focus remained on Cody as the plane taxied toward the gate where emergency crews would be waiting. "We're here," Danielle murmured to Cody, her voice soft but steady. "You made it, buddy. You're going to be okay." Danielle watched as the paramedics carefully lifted Cody from his seat, transferring him onto a stretcher. The boy's small chest still rose and fell with the aid of the oxygen mask, and though his breathing remained shallow, he was holding on. Melissa clung to Cody's hand as they moved him toward the aisle, her eyes darting between her son and Danielle. "Thank you," Melissa said, her voice trembling. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, something layered with guilt and realization. "I don't know how to even begin to repay you." Danielle's expression softened, but she remained focused. "Just focus on Cody," she replied. "He needs you now. Stay calm for him." Melissa nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand as she followed the paramedics down the aisle. The other passengers turned in their seats to watch, their faces filled with quiet awe. No one said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. Danielle could feel their eyes on her, and for once, it wasn't the weight of judgment or skepticism, it was respect. As Melissa disappeared down the jet bridge with the paramedics, Danielle sank into the seat Cody had vacated, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp and focused began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep fatigue. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them in her lap, her breath uneven as she processed everything that had just happened. The cabin remained silent, the other passengers seemingly unsure of what to do or say. Emma, the flight attendant, approached cautiously, kneeling beside Danielle with a look of admiration and concern. "Dr. Carter," Emma said softly, "what you did today, it was incredible. I've never seen anyone stay that calm under pressure." Danielle gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint, tired smile. "It's what I'm trained to do," she replied simply, though her voice was heavy with exhaustion. "I just did what anyone would have done." Emma's brow furrowed slightly. "I don't think anyone else could have done what you did. You saved his life." Danielle didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting toward the window. The tarmac lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the ground. She felt the weight of Emma's words, but didn't let them sink in just yet. Saving lives was her job, her calling, but it didn't always come with the clarity of this moment. "I'm just glad he's okay," Danielle said finally, her voice quiet. "That's all that matters." Emma placed a gentle hand on Danielle's shoulder before standing. "If there's anything you need, just let us know. You've done enough for everyone today." As Emma walked away, Danielle leaned back in the seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She could still hear the faint murmurs of the other passengers, but she tuned them out, allowing herself a moment of quiet. The events of the flight replayed in her mind. The tension, the urgency, the moment Cody started breathing steadily again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out to see a text from Malcolm. "How was the flight? Hope you're getting some rest, Doc." Danielle chuckled softly, shaking her head as she typed back a quick response. "Not exactly restful, but I'll tell you about it later." As the cabin began to clear and the passengers disembarked, several stopped to thank Danielle, their voices filled with genuine gratitude. One by one they acknowledged her, their earlier silence replaced by words of respect. "Thank you, Doctor, you're amazing. We're lucky you were here. You're an inspiration." Danielle nodded politely, offering faint smiles in return. She appreciated their words, but what lingered in her mind wasn't their gratitude. It was the quiet transformation she had witnessed in Melissa. The same woman who had dismissed her without a second thought had come to rely on her completely, and though the experience had been draining, it was a stark reminder of the power of empathy and action. So, as Danielle finally stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, she let out a long, steady breath. The weight of the flight hung heavy on her shoulders, but there was a sense of resolve that steadied her steps. She was tired, but she wasn't defeated. Not today. Not ever. Danielle sat quietly in her seat, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the armrest as the plane steadied into its course. The cabin was calm again, the chaos that had unfolded earlier now replaced by a heavy, uneasy silence. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes briefly in an attempt to settle her racing thoughts, but every time she did, the image of Cody struggling for breath came rushing back. The memory of Melissa's tearful face lingered too, filled with guilt and remorse. Emma, the flight attendant, passed by once more, pausing briefly beside Danielle's seat. "Dr. Carter," she said softly, her voice careful as though she didn't want to intrude. "I wanted to thank you again. What you did tonight, I don't think any of us will forget it." Danielle offered a small nod, keeping her expression composed. "I just did what anyone in my position would do," she replied quietly, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't entirely true. Not everyone would have done what she did, and not everyone would have been able to. That reality sat heavily in her chest. Emma hesitated, her brow furrowing as if she wanted to say more, but instead, she simply said, "If there's anything you need, please let me know." With a small smile, she moved on, leaving Danielle alone once again. Danielle sighed, her eyes drifting to the window. The city lights below had vanished into the dark expanse of the night, leaving nothing but the faint glow of stars against the inky blackness. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, calm and composed on the surface, but beneath it, she could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her. Across the aisle, the businessmen who had mocked her earlier sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. Danielle didn't care to look too closely. Their opinions no longer mattered. But their silence now was different. It wasn't indifference or dismissal. It was discomfort, perhaps even shame. She could sense it in the way they avoided meeting her eyes, the way their postures seemed smaller now, less self-assured. It wasn't the kind of change Danielle sought, but it was something. Melissa's earlier words echoed in her mind. "I don't know how to thank you." And yet, there had been no need for thanks. Danielle had done what she had to do, not for recognition or forgiveness, but because that was who she was. She had built her life and career on the principle that every life mattered, even if others didn't always extend that same belief to her. But Melissa's apology lingered, raw and unfiltered, etched into Danielle's memory. It had been genuine, of that Danielle was certain, but it hadn't erased the hurt. It hadn't undone the sting of being judged and dismissed so quickly, so carelessly. Even now, as the hum of the engines filled the cabin and the tension began to dissipate, Danielle couldn't shake the feeling of how easily that moment could have gone unnoticed, how often moments like it had. Her gaze drifted back to her phone, which sat untouched on the tray table. The hospital emails and notifications could wait. Tonight had been enough. Her hands rested in her lap, still faintly trembling from the adrenaline that had yet to fully fade. The exhaustion in her body wasn't just physical, it was the kind of fatigue that came from years of navigating spaces where she had to prove herself again and again. The plane jolted slightly as it hit another patch of turbulence, and Danielle steadied herself with a deep breath. She wasn't sure what awaited her when she returned to Atlanta, whether Cody's condition would improve or whether Melissa's apology would lead to real change in her perspective, but for now all Danielle could do was sit with the weight of the night, letting it settle into her as the plane soared through the dark sky. The plane finally took off, ascending into the dark sky as the cabin lights dimmed. Danielle leaned her head against the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. The world below faded into a patchwork of twinkling lights, and for the first time that evening, she felt a small moment of separation from everything that had transpired. The adrenaline that had kept her going through Cody's emergency had long since faded, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Her body was tired, but her mind refused to rest. Every detail of the night replayed in her head. The tension, the judgment, the cries for help, and the fleeting moments of redemption. It was a storm of emotions that she wasn't sure how to fully process. Across the aisle, the businessmen who had made cutting remarks about her earlier were unusually quiet. Their postures stiff and their gazes averted, they seemed to carry the weight of their earlier behavior. Danielle caught a glimpse of one of them stealing a glance at her before quickly looking away. It wasn't guilt she was looking for. It wasn't validation or acknowledgement either. But their discomfort was a reminder of the subtle victories that came from simply existing as her authentic self in a world that often underestimated her. She thought of Melissa's tearful apology, her voice cracking under the weight of her own remorse. The woman's face had been so raw, so unguarded in that moment, as though she had finally seen Danielle for who she was, not just a black woman in a first-class seat, but a doctor, a lifesaver, a human being. But even with the apology, Danielle couldn't ignore the deeper reality. Melissa's shift in perspective didn't erase the sting of what had happened, or the years of moments like it that Danielle had endured. It didn't undo the systemic issues that allowed such prejudices to persist in the first place. Danielle knew better than to expect one incident, one heartfelt moment of gratitude to fix what had been broken for so long. The flight attendants moved quietly up and down the aisle, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and tidying up after the long night. Emma passed by again, pausing briefly at Danielle's seat with a cup of water and a warm smile. Danielle accepted it with a nod, murmuring her thanks before returning to her thoughts. The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence, and Danielle found herself staring out into the dark expanse of the night sky. Somewhere down there, Cody was being rushed to a hospital, surrounded by doctors and nurses who would ensure his recovery. She hoped Melissa would hold on to the lessons of this night, that she would teach Cody to see people for who they truly were and not through the narrow lens of prejudice. Danielle leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing over the armrest as she took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what awaited her in Atlanta or how she would feel when she finally stepped off this plane, but she knew one thing for certain: she had done what she always set out to do. She had saved a life, and even though the weight of the night lingered, she had done so with the grace and strength that had carried her through every challenge before. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling that it was time for rest. Danielle closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic hum of the engines lull her into a tentative calm. She wasn't sure if she would sleep, but for now, she allowed herself to simply breathe. The night wasn't over, and neither was her journey. The plane ascended smoothly into the night sky, the lights of Denver fading into a speckled glow far below. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but it did little to quiet Danielle's thoughts. The subdued passengers around her were no longer restless, their earlier murmurs replaced by a heavy silence. Whether out of respect for the night's events or the lingering tension, no one seemed inclined to disturb the calm. Danielle leaned her head against the cool window, her reflection barely visible against the inky blackness outside. She closed her eyes for a moment, attempting to block out the looping images in her mind. Cody's gasps for air, Melissa's panicked cries, and the stifling judgment that had hung over her earlier in the evening. No matter how much she tried to push it aside, the simmering anger wouldn't fade. Rising above it all had been the right thing to do, but why was it always her burden to bear? Why did she always have to take the high road? A flight attendant passed by with refreshments, offering a kind smile as she paused near Danielle's seat. Danielle shook her head, declining with a quiet, "No thank you." Her stomach churned with frustration, leaving no room for food or drink. Instead, she sat back, staring straight ahead as the hum of the engines dulled into the background. She was trying to focus, to process the night's events, when a hesitant voice interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Carter?" Danielle turned her head, surprised to see Melissa standing in the aisle. Her face was blotchy from crying, her hands clasped together in a nervous grip. The confidence and entitlement that had marked her earlier demeanor were gone, replaced by a tentative, almost fragile energy. Melissa hesitated, glancing briefly at the empty seat across from Danielle. Can I sit with you for a moment?" she asked, her voice trembling. Danielle's first instinct was to refuse. Her emotions were still raw, and she wasn't sure she had the energy for this conversation. But as she looked at Melissa's tear-streaked face, she saw something genuine there, something that made her pause. Melissa's guilt was etched plainly across her expression, and Danielle could tell this was more than just about Cody's attack. This was about everything. With a small sigh, Danielle nodded. "Sure," she said quietly, gesturing toward the seat. Melissa sat down gingerly, her posture uncertain. For a moment she fidgeted in silence, her gaze darting between Danielle and the floor. Finally she spoke, her voice breaking with emotion. I don't even know where to start. I treated you horribly earlier, and now, after everything you did for Cody, I don't know how to make it right." Danielle studied her, her own expression calm but unreadable. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her tone even but firm. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in first class?" Melissa's face crumpled and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I mean, I know, but I wasn't thinking. I grew up in a place where people like me weren't exposed to people like you. I was taught certain things and I never questioned them." Her voice cracked as she added, "I thought you'd judge me, I thought you'd look down on me, and I don't even know why I thought that." Danielle's chest tightened as she listened. The story wasn't new to her, she'd heard similar explanations so many times before. People weren't born with hate or prejudice, but they were taught it, often so deeply that they didn't even realize it was there. Melissa's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with regret. "But then you saved Cody. You helped him when I couldn't, and I don't even know how to fix what I did." Danielle sat back slightly, her fingers tightening on the armrest. "You can't fix it," she said softly but firmly. "You can't undo what you did, but you can start by figuring out why you felt that way in the first place, and then you can do better." Melissa's tears spilled freely as she nodded. Her voice cracked as she said, "I will, I swear I will." A long silence settled between them, broken only by the steady hum of the engines. Melissa stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting together, while Danielle watched her with a mixture of sadness and resolve. The rawness of Melissa's remorse was evident, but Danielle knew that change didn't happen overnight. A moment of clarity wasn't enough to rewrite years of ingrained bias. Danielle's voice softened, but her words remained steady. "I don't need your apology, Melissa," she said. "What I need is for you to take what happened tonight and learn from it. Teach your son differently. Make sure he grows up seeing people for who they are, not what they look like." Melissa looked up at Danielle, her lips trembling. "I will," she whispered, her voice full of resolve. "I promise, I will." Danielle nodded, letting the silence speak for itself as she leaned back into her seat. The conversation wasn't easy, but it had been necessary. Now, as the plane hummed steadily toward Atlanta, she allowed herself a moment of quiet, her thoughts heavier than ever. The night wasn't over, but she was starting to feel the weight shift. Danielle watched Melissa retreat to her seat, her movements slow and heavy as though carrying the weight of the night's events on her back. The whispered "thank you" lingered in the air, a faint echo of guilt and realization. Danielle sighed softly, leaning back into her seat and allowing her eyes to drift toward the window. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly and the darkness outside seemed endless, an expansive void dotted faintly by distant stars. Apologies like Melissa's weren't new to her. Over the years, she had grown used to these moments when people finally saw her for who she was. Not just a black woman they had underestimated, but someone capable, intelligent, and compassionate. She had seen the vows to change, the promises to do better, but she also knew how fleeting those realizations could be. change wasn't a single moment of clarity. It was a process of slow and deliberate effort to unlearn, to reflect, to grow. Still, as she watched Melissa settle into her seat, shoulders hunched and hands still trembling, Danielle allowed herself a small, cautious sliver of hope. Perhaps tonight wouldn't just be a momentary epiphany. Perhaps it would be the start of something real, a shift in perspective that would ripple outward, not just to Melissa but to her son Cody and maybe even beyond. The hum of the engines vibrated faintly through the cabin as the plane continued its journey toward Atlanta. Danielle's gaze remained fixed on the dark sky outside, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The emotional toll of the night weighed heavily on her, but there was also a quiet sense of resolution. She had done what she had set out to do, not just save a life but rise above the ignorance and prejudice that had tried to diminish her. Her thoughts drifted to her childhood, to the lessons her parents had instilled in her. Growing up as a black girl in the South, Danielle had learned early that the world wouldn't always be kind, that she would be judged before she even spoke a word. But her parents had also taught her the power of resilience, the importance of standing tall even when the world tried to knock her down. "Let your actions speak louder than their assumptions," her father used to say, his voice steady with conviction. Tonight, those words had rung true once again. Danielle hadn't needed to defend herself to Melissa or anyone else on that plane. She hadn't needed to explain why she belonged in first class or why she deserved respect. Her actions had spoken for her, her knowledge, her skill, her unwavering compassion. And in the end, those actions had made all the difference. A plane began its descent into Atlanta, the lights of the city twinkling below like a vast sea of stars. Danielle let out a long, slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. The journey was almost over. Soon she would be back in her own home, far from the judgmental stares and the emotional turmoil of the night. But she knew the lessons from this flight would stay with her, just as all the others had. Every experience, every confrontation with bias and prejudice, added to the layers of strength she had built over the years. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't easy, but it had shaped her into the person she was today, a woman who saved lives, who stood firm in her identity, and who rose above hate and ignorance time and time again. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar sights of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport coming into view. Danielle felt a wave of relief wash over her as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. It had been a long, exhausting journey, one that had tested her patience, her resilience, and her strength in ways she hadn't anticipated. But she had made it through. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, Danielle remained seated for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her. Despite the fatigue that clung to her like a second skin, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had done her job, not just as a doctor, but as a person. She had saved Cody's life, endured Melissa's prejudice with grace, and met the night's challenges with the professionalism and integrity that had defined her career. Passengers filed past her as they exited the plane, a few of them pausing to nod or murmur quiet words of thanks. Danielle nodded back politely, though her mind was elsewhere. She didn't need their gratitude, she had never needed that. But it was a reminder that her actions, even in the face of adversity, had made an impact. She had proven who she was, not through words but through action. As the plane came to a full stop and the last of the passengers began to disembark, Danielle gathered her things, her movements slow but steady. She was tired, physically, emotionally, but she was also resolute. No matter what the world threw at her, she would continue to rise above it. Because that was who she was, and that was what she had always done. Danielle stayed in her seat until the last of the passengers had filed out of the cabin. Only then did she stand, taking her time to stretch her stiff muscles and gather her belongings. The ache in her body from the long hours of tension and the emotional weight of the night hadn't disappeared, but there was a quiet strength in her movements as she made her way down the empty aisle. Rolling her suitcase behind her, she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, where the familiar chaos of the airport greeted her like an old companion. The terminal was alive with motion. Travelers hurried by, some dragging heavy luggage, others juggling coffee cups and phones. The background noise of chatter, footsteps, and announcements blended into a comforting hum. Danielle paused for a moment, taking it all in. It felt the same as it always did, busy, rushed, and full of life. But for her, this arrival carried a deeper sense of closure. Tonight had been heavy, challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she had made it through. And now, as she stood among the endless flow of people, she felt grounded. Taking a deep breath, she started walking toward the baggage claim area. Her suitcase rolled smoothly behind her, its wheels softly clicking against the polished floor. With each step, Danielle felt herself letting go of the tension that had gripped her all night. She was ready to leave the hurt and frustration on the tarmac and return to her life. The life she had built with purpose and determination, defined not by the prejudices of others, but by her own strength. As she approached the baggage carousel, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her close friend and colleague Dr. Angela Moore. "Just finished my shift. How was the flight?" Danielle's lips curved into a small smile. Angela had been her rock since their residency days, someone who truly understood the unique challenges of navigating their field as Black women. Danielle could already imagine how their conversation would go, Angela's sharp wit providing just the balance of understanding and humor she needed after such a night. "Long story," Danielle typed back, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "I'll fill you in tomorrow." She hit send, but almost immediately another message popped up. This one was from an unfamiliar number. Her brows furrowed as she opened it. "Dr. Carter, it's Melissa Jenkins. I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did for Cody. He's stable now and the doctors say he'll be okay. I owe you more than I can say. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm working on being better. For Cody's sake and mine. I hope one day I can show you that I've changed. Thank you again." Danielle stared at the message for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Melissa's words were earnest, the gratitude and regret palpable, but Danielle knew better than to put too much stock in one heartfelt text. True change wasn't a quick fix. It required time, reflection, and consistent effort. Tonight might have been a turning point for Melissa, but it was just the beginning of a much longer journey. With a quiet sigh, Danielle pocketed her phone and turned her focus back to the carousel. She spotted her suitcase almost immediately and retrieved it in one smooth motion. The weight of it felt oddly comforting in her hand, a grounding presence after such an emotionally turbulent night. Danielle made her way toward the exit, her steps steady and deliberate. The cool Atlanta air greeted her as she stepped outside, brushing against her skin and bringing with it a sense of relief. For the first time in hours, she felt like she could truly breathe. She stood for a moment beneath the airport's bright lights, watching taxis pull up and passengers filter out, each disappearing into their own lives and destinations. Then, with a renewed sense of calm, she hailed a cab and slid into the back seat. The ride home was quiet, the city lights streaking past the window in a blur of color. Danielle leaned her head against the glass, her thoughts swirling as she reflected on the night's events. She had faced countless crises in her career, had seen life and death unfold before her eyes more times than she could count. But tonight had been different. Tonight hadn't just been about saving a life. It had been about navigating the complicated, exhausting terrain of prejudice, about maintaining professionalism and composure in the face of blatant disrespect. Melissa's apology had been sincere, but Danielle knew that prejudice didn't dissolve with a single moment of realization. It was a slow process, one that required constant effort, and while Danielle had no control over whether Melissa truly followed through on her promises to change, she did know this. Tonight, she had risen above. She had acted with grace and integrity, staying true to herself even when the world tried to diminish her worth. As the cab turned onto her quiet street, Danielle felt a flicker of peace settle over her. The night had been long, but it was over now. She had done what she always did, used her skills, her compassion, and her resilience to help others, even when they didn't deserve it. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about knowing who she was and standing firm in that knowledge. When the cab came to a stop in front of her home, Danielle stepped out, her suitcase in tow. The familiar sight of her front porch greeted her, and, for the first time all night, she felt truly at ease. She was home. As the taxi came to a stop outside Danielle's home, she handed the driver his fare and stepped out into the cool, quiet night. The familiar sight of her house, with its warm porch light glowing softly against the darkness, filled her with a much-needed sense of comfort. It wasn't extravagant or grand, but it was hers. A modest, welcoming place tucked into a peaceful neighborhood just outside the heart of Atlanta. For Danielle, it was more than just a house. It was her refuge, her sanctuary, the one place where she could shed the weight of the world and simply be herself. She climbed the steps slowly, the exhaustion of the night settling into her bones as she unlocked the front door. Stepping inside, the warmth of her home wrapped around her like a protective blanket. The silence was soothing, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos she had left behind on the plane. Setting her suitcase by the door, Danielle kicked off her shoes and made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat as she stood by the sink, gazing out at the stillness of her backyard. For a brief moment she allowed herself to let go of everything, the confrontation, the tension, the fear. She had done what needed to be done, not just as a doctor but as a person. Despite everything, the prejudice, the judgment, the countless moments where she had been made to feel lesser, she had held firm. She had stepped into a crisis with compassion and skill, and that was what mattered most. As she placed the empty glass in the sink, a faint smile tugged at her lips. The night had tested her, but it hadn't broken her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, waking Danielle gently from a deep, dreamless sleep. Her body felt heavy with the lingering fatigue of the night before, but there was a quiet peace in her heart. Stretching, she swung her legs out of bed and began to get ready for the day. Life moved on, as it always did. There were patients waiting, emergencies to respond to, and a team counting on her at the hospital. As she sat at her kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee, she scrolled through her emails. The familiar rhythm of updates and meeting reminders grounded her, pulling her mind back to the steady routine of her work. Just as she finished replying to a few messages, a new notification popped up. It was from Melissa Jenkins. "Dr. Carter, I wanted to let you know that Cody is doing much better this morning. The doctors say he's on track for a full recovery. I can't thank you enough for what you did. I've been reflecting on everything we talked about, and I'm committed to making changes, not just for Cody but for myself. Thank you, truly." Danielle read the message twice, her fingers brushing lightly over the screen. The words were heartfelt, a clear sign that Melissa was beginning to understand the gravity of what had happened. But Danielle also knew that real change wasn't something that came easily or quickly. It was a process, one that required intention and effort every single day. Melissa's journey was her own, and while Danielle had been a catalyst for that change, it was now up to Melissa to follow through. Setting her phone down, Danielle finished the last sip of her coffee and rose to her feet. The events of the night before would stay with her, just as every challenge in her life had, but they wouldn't define her. She had too much to do, too many lives to touch, too much purpose driving her forward. The prejudice she faced, the obstacles she overcame, they were pieces of a larger story, but they weren't the whole story. Stepping outside, Danielle inhaled the crisp morning air. The city was waking up around her, the streets slowly filling with life. As she slid into her car and started the engine, she let herself smile. She had faced adversity, as she always did, with grace, resilience, and strength. And she would continue to do so, no matter what the world threw her way. Thank you for joining us on Danielle's incredible journey of strength and compassion. If this story touched you, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us bring these meaningful stories to life. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.